Hello and welcome to Fast Forward Newsline. I'm David Kattenberg. My guest today is Winnipeg-based chef and radio broadcaster Anna Sigrithur. Anna has just returned from the 13th Annual Indigenous Farming Conference in Minnesota, and she's here with us today to talk about it. Indigenous Farming Conference. Tell me about this, Anna.
Yeah, so it's the 13th Annual Indigenous Farming Conference, which is hosted by the White Earth Anishinaabe Nation in the Northwoods of northern Minnesota. And it's a place where every year tribal people, Indigenous people, activists, gardeners, farmers from all around the United States and Canada and Mexico, what we call Turtle Island, come together to sort of share techniques and skills and projects and learn and share from one another.
Indigenous people, First Nations people exclusively, or a bit of a mixture?
It's definitely a mixture. It is hosted by a registered tribe, the White Earth Nation. And their focus is on providing a space for other tribal groups around Turtle Island to share. But there's certainly people like myself who are not Indigenous to North America who are present and attending.
How is this gathering different from other food gatherings, conferences that you've attended over the years, Anna? What's unique about this particular gathering?
Well, I think, for one, the fact that it is by and for Indigenous people, that makes it different from any other food gathering I've ever attended, like, for instance, the Growing Local Conference in Winnipeg, which is a great conference, but it's definitely sort of like in a more urban, settler kind of context. So that's one thing, but I also think that something that's really important about this conference is that in addition to being about projects and skill sharing, there's also a really, really important focus on culture and tradition and storytelling and oral histories and spirituality and all of these things that are really important when it comes to food and growing, but that we don't always talk about in food as it gets disambiguated into its multiple categories that we think of food as, like, eating it and growing it and selling it and whatever. So it's a very holistic conference gathering.
Yes, the foods that we eat are totally wrapped up in the lives that we live and in our history and in our culture. And I would imagine that food production and cultivation has always been used to be an intrinsic part of Indigenous culture. Tell me about what you learned about this, about the role of just recovering culture, the role of food production and eating in the recovery and the valorization of Indigenous culture.
Yeah, well, I think recovery is like the key word because, and the reason it needs to be recovered, the food culture and the cultures of a lot of these peoples, is because of colonization and the government policies and projects that very forcibly and very calculatedly, I think at times, sought to erase and suppress the productive capacity of food productive capacity of Indigenous peoples all around North America.
And the old story is that First Nations people on the Great Plains and elsewhere were hunter-gatherers. They weren't people that actually settled the land and grew traditional varieties of corn and beans and squash and shared seed and all those things associated with food and culture.
Right. That sort of trope of the hunter-gatherer is something that's extremely out of date and out of balance and pretty much patently untrue for all of the Indigenous groups in North America. Every one of them was where they were cultivating food, maybe in ways that don't look like standard monocrop European style farming, but they were extremely prolific growers to the point where, as Winona LeDuc, who's one of the members of White Earth Nation, and she's a very well-known activist and scholar, in her talk, which was about historical Anishinaabe agriculture, she talked about how in 1840, which is a little over 150 years ago, all of the crops that were grown in Minnesota were grown by non-white settlers, or people who were not white settlers. And so the majority of them were Anishinaabe people who were incredibly prolific growers, growing all of their agricultural complexes like corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, potatoes, all these things, peppers and tuber crops and grains and things like this. And they had to put policies to tell them that they couldn't sell this food in order to encourage European settlers to come so that they wouldn't be outcompeted.
What's the greatest challenge folks face today trying to reincorporate old food traditions into their daily diet in 2016?
Lots of challenges. I think geography is a big one, reservations in the United States and especially reserves in Canada. If we're talking tribal land bases are often more remote. They lack resources in terms of what we regularly consider like access to good foods, good grocery markets and things like this. But then from like a growing and cultivating standpoint, there's a lot of knowledge that needs to be reclaimed and shared and spread, taught, and indentured into communities again. And that requires a lot of time, a lot of effort, and the luxury of time and focus to be able to do that. So that nests in with a whole lot of other issues that I think a lot of Indigenous communities are facing. Canada, for sure, remoteness is a huge problem to be able to reclaim these skills because there's just people are few and far between, and it's hard to share when you're in that kind of situation.
Has your own style of cooking, Anna, changed, evolved as the result of attending these gatherings? And this is now the third time you attended the Indigenous Food Conference. How has your own cooking changed?
Well,
and you run a little business here in Winnipeg. Tell me about that.
Okay, yeah. So I'm the co-owner and chef of Clandest Diner, which is a small pop-up dinner company. And like my passion has always been sort of understanding how people relate to their, bioregion with food. So that naturally comes down to being interested in Indigenous foods because that's what that is worldwide. So just getting to learn a lot more about the Anishinaabe foods and foods from, all of the tribal groups who do come to the Indigenous Farming Conference has been really fun, especially learning a lot about corn and the different ways you can process corn has been really great.
Tell me about a couple of ways you can process corn that are totally different from what people are used to here in Winnipeg.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of things. One of the really interesting things you do to corn, which we all eat, but we don't know that we eat it, is to nixtamalize it, which means to cook it with ash, and that's what gives that kind of classic corn chip smell. That corn grain has been cooked with wood ash, which changes the protein structure. It gives more vitamins and minerals, and it makes it more pliable. So that's what you make tortillas from, or hominy, things like that. So that's been really fun to learn about and learn about the history of that and some of the origins of that method. Has been really fun.
And what else? Anything about beans?
Well, there's just a massive diversity of beans. That's just fun in itself to see, and they're so beautiful.
It's astonishing, the diversity of foods. Like I visited Bolivia once and just witnessed the dozens of different varieties of potatoes that we've totally lost up here.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely. And that's one of the really important outcomes, I think, of gatherings like this is because people are bringing seeds and they're swapping and sharing seeds and stories and cultivating tips for these varieties. So we're preserving a lot of biodiversity by doing this, which is any ecologist or any person with common sense can tell you that diversity is key to this thing called resilience, which is something that we should want. And yeah, like beans especially, and potatoes and corn. I mean, there's just so many varieties of corn. There's a variety of corn called Northern Flint corn that's from Bear Island in Minnesota, and it's these corn stalks that are like 4 feet tall, and the corn ears are this big, and they've adapted to a northern climate, and they've been found growing as far north as Thompson, Manitoba. So I mean, the diversity helps us adapt and helps us live, and we need that now more than ever. So these people are just doing work for all of us at this conference.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you.
I hope to be able to talk about this again on another occasion.
Yes, next year.
My guest today on Fast Forward Newsline has been and is Anna Sigrithur, who's a Winnipeg-based chef and radio broadcaster. You've been watching Fast Forward Newsline here at the Green Planet Monitor. It appears each week at this same time in this little box. We are generously supported by the Government of Canada, and the Social Justice Fund of Unifor. You can be a Fast Forward Newsline sponsor. Drop us a line at greenplanetmonitor.net. Join us again next week at the same time. My name is Dave Kattenberg. Bye for now.